Hello, and welcome. Tonight we'll be doing things a little differently. I'll be reading an original story. So, one that I wrote myself. It is a horror story called Satan's Hollow, and I thought it would be festive since it's Halloween. So, if you're interested, do feel free to grab a blanket, something to drink, maybe even a snack or two, and kick back, relax, and enjoy the story. Satan's Hollow, Chapter 1. The early morning air was crisp, yet thick with the scent of wood smoke and peat. Remedios stood at the edge of Acaban, where the rural village met Satan's Hollow. She stared interchangeably at the weathered sign that marked the forest's entrance, and the forest itself. "Beware all ye who enter here," was spray painted across the sign. Remedios wasn't usually so reckless. Not by nature, anyway. Ever since her brother Liam died 3 months ago, something inside her had been brewing. It was a strange feeling. She could have sworn it was like something was pulling her to the forest. And that morning, she could no longer ignore it. She needed to figure out what it was that was pulling her there. It was precisely 9 o'clock when she took a deep breath and stepped off the cracked asphalt onto the forest's damp earth. Her heart hammered in her chest as warnings from her friends and neighbors replayed in her mind. Satan's Hollow was her hometown's oldest and darkest legend. It had been her brother Liam's favorite place on earth, despite having never had stepped foot in it. He had always been fascinated by its history and how it, allegedly, didn't grow. It loomed, as he would say. The tales were many: lost children, vanishing travelers, and tragic whispers of the family who first owned the land. He often told her of the legend of the Ethelred family, how despite all their wealth and power, were driven mad by something ancient buried beneath the roots. Locals never spoke of it, not after sunset, and most certainly knew better than to ever walk near it. It was said that the forest could hide things, remember things, and that some of its memories could even walk. Not that she ever understood what that meant. Remedios walked through the forest wearing a thick winter jacket and her brother's old backpack. The weight of it dug into her shoulders. It was stuffed to the brim with protein bars, mini crisp packets, 2 large water bottles, a cheap flashlight, and an extra pair of socks. She ignored the frantic, internal voice screaming at her to turn back, and pushed past the first row of skeletal beech trees. The silence was, you could say, the first assault. The chirps of unseen insects, the distant bark of a dog, the faint hum of Acaban, all were instantly muffled. It was as if a great velvet blanket had been lowered over the world. Though the forest seemed quite unremarkable, the trees stood tall and thin, almost like they could touch the sky. Moss covered most of the rocks. She even came across a small river that seemed to run through the forest. Remedios had read the history. The stories of Satan's Hollow were not of mischievous spirits, but of overwhelming despair. People who entered returned changed, aged overnight, or sometimes not at all. The forest, it was said, feasted on joy and spat back misery. It was the reason why, sometime in the late 18th century, the local villagers had renamed the forest, originally titled the Ethelred Forest, to Satan's Hollow. The path, a clear track worn by animals, dissolved quickly. Remedios found herself navigating by the river. She tried to maintain a straight line, but the terrain was working against her and was constantly shifting. "Keep going. Just walk until you feel tired," she commanded herself. A meaningless goal, yet it kept her steady. About 15 minutes in, though time had already begun to stretch and distort, the first impossible thing occurred. She was stepping over a thick, horizontal root when she caught a scent. It wasn't the smell of decay or damp, which she had grown accustomed to. It was of cloves and lemons, the specific scent of her grandma's kitchen just after she'd finished baking a lemon cake. It was a scent that had no business being in the forest, especially one tied directly to her most cherished memories. She froze instantly. "Hello?" Her voice was thin and was quickly swallowed by the oppressive silence. The scent intensified, a phantom wave of nostalgia and warmth was instantly contradicted by the crushing cold air. Her heart was pounding. This is psychological. This is just fear. It's just my own mind, conjuring memories, she rationalized, pushing forward with renewed, desperate speed. Then came the sound. It was faint, high-pitched, and impossibly fragile. The sound of a music box winding down. The tune was simple, repetitive lullaby, being played backwards. The notes slid into the air in a chilling sequence. It seemed to come from her right, deep within a particularly knotted thicket of hawthorn. Remedios swallowed the panic rising in her throat. She balled her hands into fists so hard her nails dug into the palm of her hands. She turned slowly. The lullaby ceased abruptly, replaced by a noise that was far worse. A rustling, almost a shuffling, not of an animal on the forest floor, but of something dragging heavy fabric through dry leaves just out of sight. "Show yourself," she shouted with forced bravado. The shuffling stopped. The silence returned, now sharper, more pointed, like the tip of a knife held against her skin. Remedios took a deep breath, fighting the urge to sprint back blindly the way she came. She scanned the area in front of her, trying to identify where the sound originated from. A nearby bush shuffled. Her heart plummeted. Anticipating an animal of some sort, she took a deep breath and immediately pulled out the flashlight. She held it out as she stepped forward, prepared to use it as a weapon against whatever creature lurked within. Much to her surprise, there was no one there. Sitting neatly by the base of an enormous, moss-covered boulder was a small child's shoe, made of worn, polished leather. It was old, pre-war perhaps, and its presence was entirely unnatural. There was no matching shoe, no other sign of clothing, and certainly no trace of a body. It was simply placed, waiting. Remedios knelt, heart hammering as a freezing gust of wind whipped through the space, carrying with it a voice. It was a single, breathy whisper right next to her ear, so close that she felt the chill of it on her skin. "Gone?" It wasn't a question asked of her. It felt more like a question asked by something that was searching. Something desperate and lost. Maybe mourning the absence of the shoe's owner. Who knows? She scrambled backward, her hip striking a mossy boulder. She rose, forgetting the scent of cloves, forgetting the lullaby, and focused only on the very real voice suddenly around her, yet there was no one there. It was then she realized the forest was no longer silent. There was a murmuring, a symphony of tiny, brittle, distressed voices that seemed to rise from the very earth around her. It was like she had stepped into another realm, one where the threshold between the living and the dead was borderline non-existent. Remedios turned her back on the shoe and ran, not back to the sign, the entrance sign, but deeper into the impenetrable mystery that was Satan's Hollow. The trees closed around her like fingers, and the path she ran down was suddenly eerily straight. Chapter 2. She ran. She ran with the panicked, stumbling urgency of prey. Fear had overridden all rational thought. transforming the philosophical exercise of exploring the strange feeling brewing within her into a raw, primal struggle for survival. She didn't know what she was running from, the whisper, the shoe, the voices, but she knew with absolute certainty that remaining near it meant being hurt. The dense undergrowth that had tripped her minutes before had become strangely absent. She found herself on a path that should not have existed in nature. It was a perfectly straight and flat path paved with packed dirt. It was almost like running down a subterranean hallway, one walled in on both sides by the grasping branches of large black-barked trees. The silence, briefly broken by the murmuring, had sealed back over only to be broken by the ragged, wheezing gasps of her own lungs. Don't look back. Don't look back. The thought of her brother Liam finally clawed its way through the terror. It was a sharp, familiar pain that was lodged beneath her sternum. He had lived the dark folklore of their small country. He was the one who, many years ago, had first told her about the most sensational rumors about Satan's Hollow. Reading from old, crumbling town records and newspapers, she had scoffed then, completely dismissing any notion of ghosts and supernatural in general. He had insisted she keep an open mind, accusing her of fearing the unknown. They would then insist that fear was merely a construct one can manage with a bit of effort. But he was gone now, killed by a careless driver on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday afternoon. No ancient curse, no vindictive ghost, just a cruel, arbitrary event. The fear coursing through her as she ran was a little too similar to the helplessness she felt when she received the call. Maybe that was it. Perhaps a part of her hoped to face the force alleged malice that was so famous. If she could survive that, then maybe she could prove to herself that she'd been wrong about the supernatural, and that there was some meaning to life, that it wasn't merely an amalgamation of arbitrary events. Her brother's death in turn would have meaning. His death, then, happened not only because of some careless driver, but because it was his time. However, the reality of Satan's Hollow was proving to be more chilling than the lore. Her foot caught on a low iron protrusion, and she stumbled hard. The flashlight flew from her grip and skittered several meters ahead, its beam awakening and swinging wildly before settling on a target. Remedios lay for a painful moment, tasting mud and blood from a bitten tongue. Her eyes followed the beam of the distant flashlight. It illuminated something massive and broken. It took her a minute for her to realize it was the remnants of a stone wall. No doubt several meters high originally, it stood now collapsed and half swallowed by roots. Unlike the natural stone of the region, this masonry was finely dressed, etched with faint, complex patterns of vines and thorny roses. Dear God, she thought as she realized the stone wall was the boundary of the Ethelred estate, the infamous family whose name the forest once bore. She crawled toward the wall, retrieving the flashlight, and turned it off. It was here, she knew, that the Ethelred tragedy had unfolded in the 1700s. The patriarch Lord Elias Ethelred was said to have delved into forbidden practices, trying to harness the deep power of the woods to increase his prosperity. Instead, power was said to have corrupted his soul, then his land, and finally his family. They didn't just die. They faded, vanishing one by one, leaving behind only the cold, pervasive stain of their insanity and misery. But Remedios ran her hand over the cold stone. She immediately felt a profound wave of disorientation. The air, which had been crushingly cold, suddenly became humid and heavy like a summer afternoon, and with the heat came a new, complex sensory attack. She smelled perfume, a heady, old-fashioned floral scent that mixed with the metallic tang of old blood and something acrid like burnt sugar. A flash of movement caught her eye. High on a branch, where branches were woven almost like a canopy, a silver of white appeared. A shimmering, indistinct form. As she focused on it, the form resolved itself into the wavering outline of a woman in a high-collared gown. Her face a featureless blur and her hands raised as if in argument. The apparition was utterly silent, but the image was overlaid with an internal noise that pierced Remedi's skull, a furious high-pitched shriek that somehow conveyed pure, raw hatred. She turned to flee, but a new, dreadful sound emanated from the dark space behind the woman's shape on the branch. It was the music box again, playing clear, pristine, and chillingly sweet. The complete, cyclical lullaby of a child playing perfectly. But beneath the pretty melody, a deeper resonant sound began. It was the rhythmic, heavy thudding of a body being dragged across a wooden floor, insistent and sickening. The sound grew, seeming to come from the ground beneath her feet, vibrating up through the soles of her boots. The combination, the frantic sweetness of the child's toy and the brutal sound of the violence, snapped Remedi's nerve. It was like the spirit of Ethelred's. It was like the spirit of the Ethelreds was trapped in the forest. She was beginning to believe that perhaps there was some truth to the legends she'd so often heard from her brother. She scrambled away from the wall and found herself bolting towards the source of the thudding. Her mind was starting to ache. The irony wasn't lost on her. She didn't know what she was seeking. Maybe a refuge. Maybe an escape of some sort in the very direction of the horror itself. It felt as if the forest was no longer trying to scare her, but rather trap her in its terrible curse. Chapter 3. The thud drag sound continued, becoming a beacon of horror that, strangely enough, offered a sense of direction. She bolted toward it, reasoning that anything so violently tangible must be the center of the haunting and thus the shortest path through it. The flat, straight path ended abruptly, yielding to a bizarre landscape of sculpted earth. She was now running through a series of steep, low earthen mounds, overgrown and decaying, arranged in concentric circles. It felt like running over the remnants of an ancient, forgotten cemetery, or the purposefully leveled ruins of a large structure. The air was utterly dead. The cold was a bone-deep ache that the thick winter jacket could not fight. And there was a silence that struck her heart like suffocating, unyielding despair. The dragging sound continued, maddeningly consistent. Slowly she realized, with a sick feeling brewing in the pit of her stomach, that she was no closer to its source. It was like it was a fixed point of noise relative to her movement. When she ran, it seemed to speed up. When she faltered, it maintained a slow, funeral pace. Remedio skidded to a stop on a mound's crest. Her breath plumbed out in a big white cloud, and she stood perfectly still, forcing her racing heart to calm. She scanned the ground around her, and that's when the forest revealed its design. The mounds were natural undulations. They were the foundation of Ethelred Manor. She was walking on the leveled out memory of what was once the family home. The circular layout suggested the footprint of a grand central hall, now represented only by compressed mud and broken shards, each stone vibrating faintly with a perpetual echo of tragedy. As she stood there, a new sound manifested, one she instinctively recognized as belonging to the house's owner. It was the sound of a door slamming shut, followed by the clear, deep thump of heavy footsteps descending a wooden staircase, authoritative and deliberate. Her eyes scanned the immediate environment around her. Nothing. She breathed a sigh of relief, but no sooner had she turned around again when she saw him. He stood there, several meters away, where the imagined central doorway of the manor would have been. He wasn't shimmering like the raging woman on the branch. He was a pillar of absolute light-absorbing shadow, the shape of a tall man in heavy period clothing. Lord Elias Ethelred stood rigidly, his head tilted slightly. This presence was different. It carried no scent, no sound of anguish. There was only a crushing scent of imminent judgment and unforgivable failure. It was in that instant that Remedios had a sense of the family's tragedy. It was like it was pressed upon her mind like a brand to the forehead. The woman embodied the family's rage and despair. The child, the family's lost innocence. And this figure, this monolith, was the cause. Lord Elias had let malevolent darkness consume his world. Then a single word scraped across her mind, colder and sharper than the whisper near the shoe. Why? The darkness around the spectral figure deepened, coalescing. Despite the hour, it appeared as if the sun was quickly setting. Remedios suddenly felt an overwhelming, soul-crushing weight settle on her shoulders. A sorrow so vast and complete that it dwarfed her own grief for Liam. The memory of Lord Elias's failure, his immense regret for destroying his family, was now superimposed on her. The comparison was agonizing. Her loss for Liam had been an accident. His had been deliberate, a consequence of his own arrogance. For some reason, in the face of this absolute spiritual void, her own carefully cultivated and self-pitying despair seemed insignificant. This is what awaits me, she thought, dizzy with Lord Elias's emotions. The misery and despair will eat me alive and bind me to this earth. She dropped the flashlight. In the blink of an eye, the beam left with the sun. She found herself plunged into a darkness that was heavier than any night. The absence of light was quickly replaced by the sensation of something very large moving quickly toward her. She could have sworn she heard heavy wool fabric brushing against the air. In the blinding dark, a memory surfaced. Not the scent of clothes, but a memory of Liam. They were teenagers arguing about life, and he had told her, "Remedios, if you ever find yourself lost in the dark, never panic. Just try to find your way back to the light. Literally just put your hands out and feel your way through the space, and you'll find your way again." She scrambled backward, feeling blindly, her hands seeking anything that was not dirt. Her fingers closed around something cold and metallic. It was a rusty iron handle, fixed to a square slab of stone, several meters high in the air. When her right hand moved downward, she realized what it was. Almost every estate in the area had one. She held in her hands a cover of the Ethelred well, which stood right next to her. The heavy shadow presence was right on top of her. It felt like the air was being displaced by a sense of immense, cold suffocation. Silent words "stay" scrawled along the crevices of her mind, urging her to yield to despair. She took a deep breath and tried to remember her brother's words. His voice played in her mind like a worn-out VHS tape, telling her that fear was just a construct. She needed to simply feel her way through the dark if she wanted to find her way back to the light. Driven by his words, she pulled on the iron handle with all her might. Voices flooded her ears the second the cover came off. They murmured incoherently. Despite this, she felt the word jump pressed into her skull. She didn't want to, but felt this overwhelming pull. It was as if something was pushing her into the well. Remedios let the cover of the well fall to the earth, then grabbed hold of the well. She tightened her grip, intent on pushing herself away from it. But then came the high-pitched shrieking she had heard before. Startled, she accidentally pushed herself forward instead of backward and fell into the darkness of the Ethelred well. Chapter 4. It was a head-first dive. She hit the rough, mossy interior of the well quickly, scraping her shoulder raw, and began tumbling end over end. Air rushed past her ears with the sound of 1,000 silk sheets being torn apart. The darkness was immense, but the falling sensation had lasted for an impossible duration. Her terror faded into a strange, detached suspension. The heavy judging pressure of the spectral Lord Elias disappeared. It was replaced by something far more dizzying. The sensation of falling through time itself. The smooth, circular stone walls of the well dissolved. The rough, freezing air of Satan's Hollow was suddenly supplanted by warm, stale air that began to smell powerfully like smoke. Remedios found herself staring at a swirling, rapid series of images, fragments of a life she had never lived and only ever heard and read about. The well was like a lens all of a sudden, and she was being plunged through the captured memories of the Ethelred family. The first began with a flash of bright, blinding sunlight, so startling in the darkness that she squeezed her eyes shut. When she opened them, she was floating through a lavish, dust-filled drawing room. In the center of the space was a child, a little girl that wore the exact same type of leather shoe she found earlier. She couldn't have been older than 4 and was dressed in a white muslin frock. Her hair was the color of weak tea. The girl was playing happily, winding the very music box Remedios had heard in the woods. Her laughter and high and bell-like voice was so loud it was painful. And yet, it was the sound of pure, innocent joy. In the blink of an eye, the light laughter faded. The room was plunged into shadow. The child's face twisted in profound confusion. The music box dropped from her hands and clattered. Remedios heard the small, high-pitched shriek she'd heard near the shoe, revealing to have been the little girl being snatched by her hair by her father. The message was brutal, but clear. It seemed as if the child had been the first sacrifice, the first piece of light consumed by Lord Elias's greed for more. The second one whipped faster. Remedios was slammed into another space. This one was infused with the scent of old floral perfume from earlier, and fresh blood. The warmth was replaced by humid, choking tension. She saw the woman in the high-collared gown again, and she was no longer a blurry shape on a branch. It was clear as day the woman was Lady Ethelred. She recognized her from her portrait at Akavon's History Museum. The woman's face was contorted in a mask of grief and accusation. Tears streaked down her cheeks. She was shouting, but her voice was muted, like it was trapped in the well's water. Standing opposite her, massive and immobile, was her husband, Lord Elias. His face was pale. His eyes were red and wide. She stared at his wife with a terrifying intensity about him. His mouth was perfectly still, yet contorted in a mask of disappointment and anger. It was almost like he was simply observing, like a king observing the consequences of his actions. "How could you? She was our daughter," the woman's silent screams echoed in Remedios' mind. All for what? More prosperity? God had already blessed us with so much. What more could you possibly want, Elias? He stared at his wife and scowled, with tears foaming in his eyes. She was about to turn her back to him when she suddenly collapsed. Not from despair, but from a deliberate, heavy blow to the head. The scene soon delved into the terrible shuffling Remedios had heard earlier. The thudding and dragging sounds had been of her body being pulled across the floorboards by her husband. His movements were stiff. His face had become hollow. The scent of blood was overwhelming. The visions then sped up, coalescing into a single moment. Remedios felt herself suspended directly over a dark, swirling energy at the bottom of the well. She saw Lord Elias standing alone by the well. His clothes were torn and his hands stained. He held something small in his hands, a tiny wooden locket carved with a thorny rose. He spoke to the locket. "I bind it all here." His voice appeared in her mind, cold and clear. The grief, the rage, the greed. Let the foundation hold it. Let the misery be eternal. Let this place feed on what I have done, so that my sins are never forgotten. What was this? Remedios thought. His way of seeking penance? Lord Elias had consciously bound the spirits of his family, along with his own crushing guilt, to the land itself, using that locket and the well as the anchors. Satan's Hollow didn't just remember. It was forced to replay it to anyone who dared enter it. Forever. The vision snapped shut like a camera shutter. The speed of the fall returned, sudden and violent. She hit the bottom with a sickening heavy squelch. She found herself buried up to her chest in cold, viscous muck. A thick, peat-like sludge, heavy with minerals and the absolute absence of life. The stench was nauseating. I felt like standing in the heart of the forest's compost pile. Although she was alive, she constantly spat out the metallic taste of the foul mud and gasped for air that reeked of smoke and decay. The immense, oppressive silence had returned, but now it was different. She had descended past the surface layers of the haunting and had by some miracle reached the source. The wall of the well around her was rough, cold stone again. She moved around, wondering what to do when she heard something pressed in between her right foot and the cold stone wall of the well. Remedios reached into the slick mud and felt something embedded in it. She pulled it out. She could hardly believe what she was feeling in her hands. It was the tiny wooden locket carved with a thorny rose. She knew with horrible certainty of someone who had just witnessed a double homicide and a suicide that she had found the key to the Ethelred curse. The key to the terrible hauntings were in her hand, and yet it didn't feel like a good thing. Something deep in the pit of her stomach screamed at her that the hauntings were only going to get worse. Chapter 5. The well reeked of more than just rot. It reeked of regret and despair. It rose around her, cold and suffocating, wrapping around her ankles like an icy shroud. She stood at the bottom of the well, alive but utterly exposed. Her heart hammered and demanded movement. Survival instincts, which had been forgotten in the philosophical, grief-driven quest, roared back to life. She glanced at the wooden locket again. The silent question of Lord Elias, "Why?" returned, physically pressing down on her skull. It drove her knees deep into the sludge. The sensation of the massive, shadowy presence was back. Localized and infinitely heavier than before, concentrated in the small, stagnant space. She could feel it. The pressure wasn't simply regret, but fury, possessive and territorial. "You do not take what is mine." Remedios fought against the spiritual gravity. She tightened her grip on the locket and tucked it safely in her jacket pocket. As she zipped it up, the heavy dragging sound returned. This time it was right beside her. The rhythmic thud drag sound seemed to emanate from the very stone she was standing near, as if the body of Lady Ethelred was being pulled across the floor of the well's base, centimeters from her feet. scrambled to the side wall, ignoring the pain in her shoulder. The stone was rough and damp, offering minimal grip. The wall shaft was terrifyingly deep, and she could only see the perfect starless circle of darkness. Liam's words echoed in her mind. Find the thing you know is solid. The stone wall was solid, her muscles cold and weak. Medios was desperate for a way out of this nightmare. The initial reach was the hardest. Her boots, heavy with mud, pulled her downward, and the slick moss covering the lower stones made her hands slide repeatedly. That is until she found shallow old mortar lines between the stones. She used her fingertips and the strength of her fingernails to catch hold. It was slow, agonizing work. Every foot gained, paid for with scraped skin and desperate, shuddering effort. As she climbed higher, she transitioned from muck to the colder running water that trickled down the well shaft. The change in physical texture brought a change in the spirit's attack. Around the 4-meter mark, where the air was colder and the stone slicker, the well's history began to manifest visually again, not as clear visions, but as translucent, swirling colors clinging to the inner curve of the stone. A haze of angry red and sickly white. Lady Ethelred's silent rage returned and vibrated along her arms. She looked down, and for a terrifying second, a pale and featureless face emerged from the slick stone directly below her, its mouth opened in an accusatory "Oh." Remedios pressed her cheek against the freezing stone. Fighting the urge to look away and fall, she focused on the feeling of the rough stone, repeating Liam's name like a mantra against the noise. Liam. 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 Her own grief, however sharp, felt like a shield against the crushing ancient misery and despair of the Ethelreds. 9 meters up, the child's presence returned. She heard the faint, high-pitched shriek right above her head, followed by the softest touch. It felt like a small, cold hand briefly resting on her hair. It was almost paralyzing, her mind suddenly filled with desolate, innocent sadness. It nearly broke her resolve, not menacing by any means, rather pleading, as if asking her to come back down, to join them in their eternal misery. "Stay with me," a thought whispered. A scent of cloves and lemon loomed in the stale air around her, almost as if a final, lethal appeal to her shattered memories of warmth and safety. Part of her knew that if she paused, if she gave in to the seductive lie of shared sorrow, she would become a part of the wall, another soul eternally bound to the locket. She ignored the paralyzing cold and the phantom child, leveraged her weight to pull herself up another few meters. She was close now. Her hands began to recognize the shape of the metal handle above. As her hands reached up, brushing the stone lip of the well, the final instruction appeared. The great, monolithic shadow of Lord Elias coalesced around the opening, blotting out the faint black on black of the sky. He was guarding the exit, his presence immense and final. He did not move, but a question began to press her skull with terrifying clarity. "Return it." She let out a choked cry, a sound of defiance and fear, then launched herself upward. She used the last of her energy to grab the iron rim and haul herself over the edge. Her jacket caught on the rough stone. The fabric tore with a harsh, rasping sound. She collapsed onto the mud, sucking in huge, ragged breaths of cold, clean forest air. The shadow in the well opening vanished instantly, retreating as if recoiling from the surface. Remedios was out. She was shivering, scraped, soaked in mud, and her hand was clutching the locket in her pocket fiercely. Satan's hollow had tried to swallow her whole, and she had escaped. But she hadn't escaped empty-handed. She had brought its deepest, darkest secret with her. The forest was utterly silent, as if waiting for her next move. Chapter 6. Remedios lay on the cold, sodden earth for a full minute. Her body shook from the cold and the spiritual violation of the well. The mud of the Ethelred's final resting place was on her face, her hands, and deep within her jacket. But in her hands, pulled out from her jacket pocket, was the wooden locket. She breathed a sigh of relief. The oppressive, crushing presence of Lord Elias was gone. For the moment, anyway. There was a silence to the forest, profound and deeper than before. It felt like the forest had been holding a 300-year-long scream, and now, having lost its heart, was waiting to see what would fill the void. Remedios pushed herself up, staggering to her feet. Her mind, usually so level-headed, was buzzing with the horrifying truth of the visions. The Ethelred tragedy hadn't been a series of vanishings and unexplainable deaths, but a series of murders which ended in suicide, all of which anchored by a piece of carved wood. Lord Elias had used the locket to bind the entirety of the family's sorrow to the land, ensuring their collective misery would never fade, consequently creating an entity of sorts that enabled Satan's Hollow to terrorize the living. And all of it for what? That part she didn't understand. Why he wanted his sins to be remembered forever. She looked down at the locket in her hand, feeling the residual cold emanating from it. The thorn-carved rose was clearly visible now. She thought long and hard. Simply walking away wasn't an option. The forest had allowed her to escape the well, but removing the anchor meant challenging the curse itself. "I won't let you keep doing this," she whispered, voice rough and cracked. "You can't keep pulling people into your misery." As if summoned by her defiance, the atmosphere around her curdled. She was instantly surrounded by 3 spectral figures, now terrifyingly clear, drawn by the presence of the locket. The child stood closest, her muslin dress still impossibly clean, her eyes wide and pleading. The sound of the lullaby began to coil around her. Lady Ethelred materialized further back. Her beautiful face was a ruin of tears. The phantom floral perfume swirling was suffocating. The lady's silent screams were palpable and pressed against Remedios' mind, demanding the return of the locket. Then came Lord Elias, spanning the area like a monument carved from shadows. He stood close, a menacing grin carved on his face. His presence was practically a wall of unforgivable regret. He wanted the locket back. That much was clear. She raised the locket. Her own grief for Liam, which had driven her there, felt small in their presence, a pain she could eventually navigate. The Ethelred pain, however, was vast and eternal. It lashed onto anyone and everyone it could and was suffocating. It was in that moment that she realized that grief was destined to flow like a river, and Lord Elias had made his family's grief into a dam. "This isn't the way," she said, addressing Lord Elias, her voice trembling but firm. "You can't keep making your misery a problem for other people." She then did the only thing she could think of to break the curse, using the environment itself against it. Remedios took the small wooden locket and, with a violent, desperate surge of strength, smashed it down against the sharp, broken edge of a stone that stuck out of the ground. The wood was old and brittle. It shattered instantly. The result was a sudden, devastating silence. Wooden fragments scattered across the ground. The 3 Ethelred spirits reacted in unison, Lord Eliza's great shadowy form shivered like a curtain being dropped, and then dissolved into absolute nothingness. The crushing weight of judgment lifted instantly. Lady Ethelred's fury turned into a gasp, a single soft sigh. Her perfume faded from choking intensity to a single delicate whiff, then was gone. The child's backward lullaby stopped, and for one pure glorious second, Remedios heard it play properly. A few clear, perfect notes of the lullaby played before the child's image faded into mist, finally released from her loop of lost innocence. Remedios dropped the few fragments of wood left in her hand and felt a profound release. It wasn't just that the ghosts were gone. The atmosphere pressure on the forest itself was gone. The air was still cold but breathable. The sun returned and sat rather low in the sky. The suffocating dome of silence lifted, and she could hear the forest come alive. Leaves rustled in the wind and birds began to sing. Satan's Hollow had changed from a pit of misery and despair to what it always was, deep down. A very old forest. She didn't wait to check. Exhaustion washed over her, almost like waves crashing against the shore. The fear-fueled adrenaline was fading. Medios turned around and tried to make her way out of the forest. The escape was a blur of mud and scraped knees. Despite the return of daylight, the forest was still a confusing maze. The trees and terrain looked eerily similar wherever she turned, but she could feel the difference as she walked. The trees no longer seemed to hate her. The path remained difficult, but the terrain no longer actively twisted itself to confuse her. The difference was practically day and night. Remedios carefully maneuvered routes and leapt over small streams, driven by the knowledge she had chosen life over the eternal misery she had witnessed in the well. Her grief for Liam was still there, a constant ache, but it no longer felt overwhelming and cruel. More like a wound, one she had to tend, rather than a void swallowing her whole. Several hours later, covered head to toe in mud, she saw it. The entrance sign to Satan's Hollow. She sighed with relief. Our nearby lamppost flickered to life and cast a sickly yellow glow as the sun began to set. She rushed through the last row of skeletal breached trees and stumbled onto the cracked asphalt. She was home. The scent of damp peat and wood smoke, which had seemed suffocating earlier, now smelled like safety. Remedios stopped at the edge of the light and dropped to her knees. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a broken piece of locket. Single, sharp shard. She looked back at the dense, dark edge of Satan's Hollow. It looked exactly as it had before. Imposing, silent, and ancient. But she knew its soul had been exorcised. She stood up, the mud cold and heavy on her clothes, and began the long, quiet walk back to the village. Remedios clutched the remaining shard of the Ethelred curse, ready to finally start, carrying her own sorrow toward the light. The end. If you're still here, I want to thank you so very much for listening to this story. I really hope you enjoyed it. Do please like and subscribe if you like this kind of stuff. And I hope you have a very happy Halloween. Until next time, keep reading, keep resting, and remember to take care because I care. Good night and cozy dreams.